Well, nothing is as revealing or dangerous in life as the accidental slip of the tongue. Do you know what I mean by a slip of the tongue? Well, let me ask it another way. Has your mouth ever outran your brain? And by the time your brain catches up, it's too late? If you're anything like me, you do it all the time, even when you're preaching sometimes. Often this is referred to as a Freudian slip. According to the famous neurologist Sigmund Freud, a slip of the tongue is dangerous because it actually reveals some unconscious part of our mind. In other words, a slip of the tongue reveals something that we actually believe to be true. For example, when your mother-in-law shows up at your front door, instead of saying, "I'm glad you're here," you accidentally say, "I'm mad you're here." Or when your wife asks you if she looks fat in this dress and you say moo instead of no. That does not come from personal life experience, let me assure you. Today, gentlemen, if you've ever made that mistake before, today we know that this is true. It's proven that Freud's theory is not 100% accurate. Not every slip of the tongue reveals something that you secretly believe to be true. A slip of the tongue can also result from stress or just speaking too quickly or distractions, but it is true that a lot of the time, how we respond or how we react to something reveals something about what we actually believe to be true and about who we are. That gut reaction speaks volumes about us. The language you choose to use when you accidentally stub your toe on the coffee table says something about you. Or how you react to someone cutting you off in traffic says something about who you are. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we have to be very careful, not only to control those reactions. It's not just about that. It's not just about how can I control these reactions. More than that, we also have to ask ourselves why we are reacting in this way at all. Like not just, well, let me control those secret motives in the back of my brain, but also, what does that reaction say about us? What does that gut reaction reveal about our relationship with Christ? Or what does that gut reaction reveal about our maturity of faith? In Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas find themselves jailbirds in the city prison. They've been dealt a bad hand, to say the least. After Paul casts a demon out of a slave girl, they are dragged before the Philippi city officials, and without trial, without judge and jury, they're whipped with rods, they're shackled, which is quite painful, and they're thrown into the slammer. They had every right to feel gypped, mistreated. The abuse was unjust and illegal. I think that if I were in their place, I would have felt pretty angry. What about you? I would have felt pretty upset. More than that, I think I would have felt betrayed and disheartened in my faith a little bit. After all, they were doing this for God, right? They were God's missionaries. I might have been saying, "Hey, man, what's the big deal? What are you doing to us here?" That might have been my gut reaction. But did you notice that's not how Paul and Silas react at all? Paul and Silas react in a way that is truly remarkable and truly Christ-like. So the question I want us to explore today is this: how do you respond when life's not fair? How do you react? And how do you respond when life isn't fair? So Paul and Silas respond first, did you notice? By praying and singing hymns. That's what Luke says about them. That's the first thing. They respond by praying and singing hymns. Even though they were badly mistreated, the language they choose to use is language of praise and language of joy. And they also knew that they had an audience. Notice what Luke says in verse 25. Luke says, "And the other prisoners were listening to them." It's a remarkable little statement right there, isn't it? One that gets overlooked. And the other prisoners were listening to them. Whenever Luke uses that word listen or hear, it always implies something more than just overhearing. Luke never uses that word, and it just means, oh, they just heard that this was going on. Whenever Luke uses that in his gospel or in the book of Acts, it always means something a little bit more. It implies a type of listening that goes beyond the ears and into the heart. They were intently listening to Paul and Silas's reaction, and without even being aware of it, what they're really listening to is Jesus himself. That's the type of listening that Luke always has in mind. Without even knowing it, they're listening to Paul and Silas sing and pray, and without even knowing it, what they're actually listening to is Jesus. Be careful. Be careful with the words you choose to use, especially when life's not fair, because those words are either going to help or they're going to hinder. That's the lesson Mary Dillon learned. Y'all know who Mary Dillon is? You shouldn't. In a New York Times article entitled "Mary Talked Too Much" from the year 1900, a certain woman named Mary was charged in court with public intoxication. The judge said to her, and I'm quoting bits and pieces from the article, the judge said to her, "You seem to have been very drunk, Mary. I guess I'll send you to jail for 10 days. I don't give an expletive deleted if it's a month," remarked Mary defiantly. So the judge gave her a month in jail. "What do I care?" replied Mary sarcastically. "I ain't going to Newport this summer. Make it 3 months if you want her." So the judge gave her 3 months in jail. But did that stop Mary? No, it sure didn't. "Why don't you make it 6 months while you're at it if you're so generous?" rejoined the talkative prisoner with what was meant to be a sneer. "I'll make it 6 months, declared the judge, "and if you talk back any more, I'll send you up for a year." And the article concludes, Mary concluded to stop talking and was led away by the court officer. 10 days turned into 6 months because somebody didn't think very carefully about the words they were going to use. So when life's not fair, what words do you choose to use? And I was trying to think about it for our context. Let's think hypothetically. So think into the future with me. Hypothetically, if the 2020 election doesn't go the way you want it to, how are you going to respond to that? Or if someone says something demeaning about your family, like what if somebody says something demeaning to your wife and you're standing right there, or about your kids and grandkids, how will you respond to them? When somebody on Facebook writes something that you disagree with, when somebody on Facebook writes something you disagree with and you decide, well, I need to comment on that, will you actually comment? What will you say? How will you say it? These things are worth thinking about because whether we want to admit it or not, words are important. Words are important in the language you choose to use. It is important. Paul and Silas know it. Mary Dillon learns it the hard way. Words are important. Do you know the old saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me"? Baloney. That's not true. That's not true at all. Words do hurt. More than that, words have power. Proverbs 18:21 reminds us, the tongue has the power of life and death. Think about that statement just for a little bit. The tongue, the words you choose to use, they have the power of life and death. You know, the pastor that I used to work for in the Woodlands, Bruce Webb, his daughters were in sports. They're in cross country. And at the beginning of every season, whatever his girls were doing, cheerleading or cross country or whatever, Bruce would go have a conversation with their coach, and he'd say, "You know that you hold my child's ego right here, don't you? Like, you hold it right here in your hands, and what you say to this child out here could severely affect them, or it could severely boost their ego. Like, you're holding my child right here." There is power in what we say to people. The power of life and death is in the tongue. And as a Christian, which means little Christ, as Christians, you are marked with His name. The name Christ is upon you. So everything you say is a reflection of Christ to the world around you. You are bearing Jesus' name. So everything you say is a reflection of Jesus Christ. Your tongue has the power of life and death. With your words, you can speak truth about Jesus. And with your words, you can speak lies about Jesus. We have to be very careful with our language. And just like Paul and Silas in that dingy prison cell, guess what? Others are listening to us. Our kids, our grandkids, our families, your co-workers. People are listening to you. Will you praise? When life's not fair, will you praise or will you pout? Be careful with the words you choose to use, especially when life's not fair. Secondly, Paul and Silas refused to take advantage of the situation when they had the chance. They refused to take advantage of that situation when they get the chance. When those prison chains fell off and the cell doors unbolted, I don't know why they didn't make a break for it. Isn't that interesting? They just stood there. It was the perfect opportunity to escape. In fact, I'm not sure why they didn't interpret that as God's way of rescuing them. Like, God doesn't say it directly. He doesn't say, "Run, here's your chance." He didn't say that per se, but if all of a sudden the doors open and your chains fell off, like, wouldn't you assume that this is God's way of saying, "Go on, here's your get out of free jail card"? But they don't do that at all for some reason. Why? Maybe it's because Paul and Silas simply have other people in mind besides themselves. Maybe for some reason they realize that what they're doing in this particular position they're in, even though it's not favorable by any means, that maybe there's some sort of blessing and God has some sort of other people in mind even through their suffering. You know, running out of the prison, it makes sense if a person is only thinking of their own safety and their own well-being. Running out of the prison makes sense if you're a selfish person. Perhaps Paul and Silas just knew that if they skipped town, other people's lives would have been at stake. If they just ran out of that prison and taken off, what about all the other Philippian Christians? What about Lydia and her family who had just become, what about them? Or namely, the person who's most at stake here is that prison guard who almost commits suicide. As soon as that prison guard realizes what's happened, he assumes that all the prisoners have escaped, and rather than facing a humiliating public trial and even a possible death sentence, he decides that he's going to take his own life. Like, that's the only way out. But just at the right minute, Paul calls out to him and stops his hand. And when the jailer sees that not one of the prisoners has left, he is so moved that he asks, "What must I do to be saved?" And the missionaries have their opportunity. They share the gospel, and another Philippian family, just like Lydia's, another Philippian family is baptized into the faith just because they refuse to take advantage of a situation. You see, integrity and honesty and refusing to take advantage of others, it really matters in our witness and our mission to other people. In 1924, Liberty magazine sent out 100 letters to people selected at random throughout the U.S. Each letter contained a $1 bill and explained that it was an adjustment of an error that the addressees had complained of, which they had never done. And of the 100 recipients, only 27 returned the dollar and said it was a mistake. That's it, 27 out of 100. And in 1971, Liberty conducted the same test, and this time only 13 people returned the money. So what about you? Would you have returned the $1 bill? It's just $1, right? Like, what difference does it make? It's $1. $1 doesn't amount for anything. You can't pay for anything today with $1. But that's not the point. The point is your integrity and your own honesty, and the fact that even if it's $1, you bear the name of Christ on you. And I thought about this. Is your integrity worth $1? Hopefully your integrity is worth a little bit more than that. Is your own integrity and honesty worth more than $1? Or let's imagine this, a different scenario here. Let's imagine that you're shopping at Kroger's, and you get to the car and you notice that the cashier hasn't rung up one of your items in the bag. Has that ever happened to you before? It's happened to me before. So you notice, oh, they forgot to ring up this item. Would you go back in and pay for the item? Or would you take advantage of the cashier's carelessness? Kroger has plenty of money, right? Like, Kroger's not going to miss a few dollars here or there, right? What does it matter if that Kroger gets my $2 for a can of peas? I obviously don't know how much a can of peas costs. Amy does all the shopping. But that's not the point, right? The point's not that Kroger has plenty of money. That's not the point. The point is your own integrity and your own honesty. Is your integrity worth a can of peas? Furthermore, if you did walk back into Kroger and pay for the item, if you did actually get out of your car, as steamy and as hot as it is in August in Orange, Texas, Lord have mercy, is it steamy around here? If you actually did get out of your car and walk back into Kroger, I wonder what it would communicate to that person behind the counter. I wonder what it might communicate to them. I wonder if they would look at you like you're a little crazy. And I wonder if they might ask you, you came all the way back in here to pay for this can of peas? Why? Oh, and why? When somebody asks you why in public, that's a beautiful question right there. Because even though they may not mean it, even though they may not be really knowing what they're asking, for you, that's your opportunity. That's the opportunity we're all waiting for somebody to ask you why. It's the same chance that Paul and Silas receive. They don't take advantage. And that guard asks them, what do I need to do to be saved? It's the question we're all waiting for. Interestingly, so this is really interesting, I think, in the passage. The Philippian jailer isn't really asking about salvation in Jesus. That's not what he's asking. So just like that cashier may ask you, why'd you come back in here to give me a can of peas? Your answer is, well, I have Jesus in my life, and that's the right thing to do. It's not really what they're asking, but it's your chance. The Philippian jailer wasn't really asking about Jesus Christ either. In the Roman world, earthquakes, which is what happened in the text. An earthquake happens and the doors open and the chains fall off. But earthquakes in the Roman world are interpreted as a sign of the God's anger or some sort of coming judgment. Earthquakes, natural disasters were always interpreted as the gods must not be pleased with what we're doing. So maybe we should think about doing something else. So New Testament scholar Ben Witherington points out that the jailer may have just interpreted these events as nothing more than that. The anger of the God, or one of the gods in their pantheon of gods. So when he asked them, what must I do to be, the word is really rescued, he doesn't have Jesus Christ in mind. He doesn't have salvation in Jesus in mind. He's asking, what can I do to be saved or rescued from the coming judgment of whatever God just calls that earthquake? Witherington says it's possible that he meant no more than rescued from the coming and apparent judgment signaled by the earthquake. However, the jailer's real question doesn't matter to Paul and Silas. It didn't matter what he meant. As soon as they had their opening, they told him about Jesus. And it's the same thing we should be waiting for. So when that Kroger cashier asks, why? That's your chance. That's how your integrity and who you are and how you live as a person and that gut reaction to these things, that's why it matters. There's missional implications on who you are as a person, integrity, refusing to take advantage of someone even when you feel it's deserved. Or even when you feel like Kroger's has plenty of money, or even when life's been unfair lately, it can be actually opportunity to witness to Christ. So be careful with the language you choose to use when life's not fair. Don't take advantage of a situation just because you think it's okay. And lastly, and this one's remarkable to me. This last one's remarkable to me. Paul and Silas willingly give up their privilege for the sake of the gospel. Whatever privilege or advantage they had been given, they willingly give it up to help the gospel. Paul and Silas are Roman citizens. In fact, that may be even one of the reasons that Paul chooses Silas to go on all these adventures and be his new partner. Because being a Roman citizen, it just gave you certain advantages in this world. One of those advantages was that you couldn't be punished without a trial. Like that was one of the basic advantages and privileges of being a Roman citizen. That if you were accused of something, they couldn't just whip you, shackle you, and throw you in prison. You had to go through a trial. That wasn't given to everybody. That was given to Roman citizens. In fact, a Roman province could get in huge trouble for violating that rule. So Philippi it's a part of the Roman extension. It's not an official Roman city. It's a province of Rome. They could have gotten in huge trouble. That's why the magistrates are so scared when they find out who Paul and Silas really are. That's why they're trying to shoo them out of town, because they're going, oh, whoops. We just beat and shackled and threw into prison without a trial Roman citizens. We're in trouble. Get these guys out of here before anybody finds out. And you notice Paul at the end says, nuh-uh, you're not going to kick us out like that. And so in light of all that, in light of all their privileges and advantages, New Testament commentator David Garland asks a really good question. David Garland asks, why then does Paul announce their status after he and Silas have been released? Why does he wait? They could have avoided all that suffering, all that persecution. They could have avoided the whips and the shackles and the prison. They could have avoided all of it if they would have spoken up sooner. So why did they wait? Well, Dr. Garland comes to the conclusion that Paul and Silas do it intentionally. They do it on purpose for the sake of the gospel. For example, if they would have gone to trial, it would have taken a long time. Trials take a long time. Getting that jury together and the judge and all that goes into that, that takes a long time today, doesn't it? It would have taken a long time back then. So maybe they didn't want their mission work to be delayed. So they were on a mission. They were doing stuff. So they just thought, we'll take the beatings if that'll move on the mission a little bit quicker. That's a possibility. It also could have been that they had just other converts in mind who weren't Roman citizens. They had other people in mind that didn't have their privileges and their advantages. Isn't that a remarkable idea for a Christian, to have other people in mind? But just think about that. Paul and Silas had the protection from state persecution, but what about all the other Philippian converts? What about Lydia and her family when they got into trouble with the Philippians? what would happen to, what about the jailer? When the Philippian magistrates find out that this jailer and his family became Christians, what about them? Dr. Garland observes, how could Paul convince others we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God? Something he says in Acts chapter 14, verse 22, after he gets almost beat to death. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, when he had a get-out-of-jail-free card. How could he tell other Christians suffering is the way of Christ, when all the while he's able to say, well, not for me. I mean for you guys. It wouldn't have been very fair at all to all those other Christians. And so he gives up whatever privileges or advantages he has for the sake of spreading the gospel. And you know, sometimes letting go of our own privilege might just be the best way to help other people come to know Jesus as well. Do you know the story of Saeed Abedini? Odd name, but he's a Christian pastor. Pastor Abedini, a former Muslim, was used by God to help found more than 100 churches in 30 cities in Iran with more than 2,000 members. He and his wife were forced to move from Iran to the United States in 2005 when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad rose to power, and the situation became really dangerous for Christians there. And while visiting family in Iran in 2012, though, Abedini was arrested and thrown into prison, where he underwent horrific torture and isolation for 3 years. But even then, what Abedini discovered is that God had a plan. Even through all that suffering and hardship, during his first year in prison, his first year alone, Abedini led 10 inmates to Christ. And here in the United States, Christians are losing privileges all over the place. Do y'all see that trajectory in our culture? The Christian church, we're losing a lot of our privileges and advantages too. There's a loud voice in America right now saying that churches shouldn't get tax breaks anymore. It's a growing voice too. It's not so odd to look into the future and see a day when lots of churches are having to close their doors because they can't afford to keep up with the place without those tax breaks. That wouldn't be an odd future in America. White evangelical Christianity is under fire right now, and there's probably some merit to that. We haven't always been the best. The Southern Baptist Convention was created over the issue of slavery. We haven't always been the best. I understand that, but it's not too odd to look into the future and see a day when our privileges and our advantages are being taken away from us. The more and more and more the church and the state and church and culture just drift apart. It's not odd to think of a day when we've lost all of our own privileges and advantages. And that's scary, right? I mean, that's scary for me. This is my career here. It's scary to think about that one day. And it terrifies me. And you know how I want to respond to it a lot of the time, right? How I want to respond is pretty negatively. I want to find somebody to blame. And I want to call them ugly names. And I want to put them down. And I want to try to keep them on the bottom of our society and out of public opinion and out of public voice because it scares me. This is my future. This is my family here. I don't like to think of a day when we lose it. But you know what? The truth is, and this is the truth about the church historically. The truth is the church has always done better when we are out of a position of power. You can look back through our history and you just know that it's true. The church has always done better when we don't have any more power. Always been more missional, always been more subversive, always been seeking and saving and finding lost people. The church always does better when we give up our privilege and our advantages. When the church has too much power historically, that's when it's also been the most corrupt and the most damaging to the kingdom of God. So giving up your power and privilege, it actually could help lead people to Christ. It actually could help your Christian witness. And so if you think that it would, if it's possible that it actually could help us, hypothetically, would you do it? Would you give up your privilege and power if you thought it would help other people come to know Christ, even if it feels unfair? Even if we think that we're in the right, would you do it? You could throw a fit in these coming years, and you could cross your arms and stomp your feet and put your fingers in your ears and yell, no, 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 like my 4-year-old Beckham when he doesn't get his way. Or you could try to be like Pastor Saeed Abedini, who even though he's thrown into prison and all of his rights and privileges are taken away from him, he still sees that God had some sort of purpose in all this. And he still winds up saving people, even in a dingy prison cell. That maybe our sacrificing for the gospel's sake, sacrificing for Jesus Christ in the gospel, is always better than holding on to whatever privilege or power we can create for ourselves. I think that's absolutely true. Sacrificing for Jesus is far better than holding on to anything we could create for ourselves. So back to my earlier question. How do you respond when life's not fair? Or maybe we should word it a little bit differently now. How will you respond when life's not fair? It's worth thinking about because the way you respond will ultimately point people towards Christ or away from Him. How you respond will ultimately point people toward Christ or away from Him. And one day you will have to give an account of your witness. One day you'll have to stand before Jesus and give an account of how you witnessed Him and His name. So don't let a Freudian slip keep you from entering the kingdom of God. It's not always true, but a lot of the time how we respond says something about who we really are. So who are you? Would you pray with me?